Good Sunday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for September the 17th. Today, we're reading together the last chapter of 1 Kings. We'll be in 1 Kings chapter 22. Let me get the text on the screen for us, and we'll read along together today here, this final chapter of 1 Kings, and it's also going to be the final chapter that we read about Ahab being the king over the northern portion of Israel. We would certainly say his reign has been one filled with wickedness and evil, and we're going to see justice being rendered to him within this particular chapter. So 1 Kings chapter 22, verse number 1, there was a lull for 3 years without war between Aram and Israel. However, in the third year, King Jehoshaphat of Judah went to visit the king of Israel. The king of Israel had said to his servants, "Don't you know that Ramoth Gilead is ours? But we're doing nothing to take it from the king of Aram." So he asked Jehoshaphat, "Will you go with me to fight Ramoth Gilead?" Jehoshaphat replied to the king of Israel, "I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." But Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "First, please ask what Yahweh's will is." So the king of Israel gathered the prophets, about 400 men, and asked them, "Should I go against Ramoth Gilead for war, or should I refrain?" And they replied, "March up, and the Lord will hand it over to the king." But Jehoshaphat asked, "Isn't there a prophet of Yahweh here anymore? Let's ask him." The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "There is still one man who can inquire of Yahweh, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good about me, but only disaster. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah." "The king shouldn't say that," Jehoshaphat replied. So the king, this is referring to Ahab, called an officer and said, "Hurry and get Micaiah, son of Imlah." Verse number 10, now the king of Israel and King Jehoshaphat of Judah, clothed in royal attire, were each sitting on his own throne. They were on the threshing floor at the entrance to the gate of Samaria, and all the prophets were prophesying in front of them. Then Zedekiah, son of Cheanah, made iron horns and said, "This is what Yahweh says, you will gore the Arameans with these until they are finished off." And all the prophets were prophesying the same: "March up to Ramoth Gilead and succeed, for Yahweh will hand it over to the king." The messenger who went to call Micaiah instructed him, "Look, the words of the prophets are unanimously favorable for the king, so let your word be like theirs and speak favorably." But Micaiah said, "As Yahweh lives, I will say whatever Yahweh says to me." So he went to the king, and the king asked him, "Micaiah, should we go to Ramoth Gilead for war, or should we refrain?" Micaiah told him, "March up and succeed. Yahweh will hand it over to the king." But the king said to him, "How many times must I make you swear not to tell me anything but the truth in the name of Yahweh?" So Micaiah said, "I saw all Israel scattered on the hills, like a sheep without a shepherd. And Yahweh said, they have no master. Let everyone return home in peace." So the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "Didn't I tell you he never prophesies anything good about me, but only disaster?" Then Micaiah said, "Therefore, hear the word of Yahweh. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne, and the whole heavenly army was standing by him at his right hand and at his left hand. And Yahweh said, who will entice Ahab to march up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?" So one was saying this, and another was saying that. Then a spirit came forward, stood in Yahweh's presence, and said, "I will entice him." Yahweh asked him how. He said, "I will go and become a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." Then he said, "You will certainly entice him and prevail. Go and do that. You see, Yahweh has put a lying spirit into the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and Yahweh has pronounced disaster against you." Then Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, came up, hit Micaiah on the cheek, and demanded, "Did the spirit of Yahweh leave me to speak to you?" Micaiah replied, "You will soon see when you go to hide in an inner chamber on that day." Then the king of Israel ordered, take Micaiah and return him to Amnon, Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash, the king's son, and say, this is what the king says. Put this guy in prison and feed him only a little bread and water until I come back safely. But Micaiah said, if you ever return safely, Yahweh has not spoken through me. Then he said, listen, all you people. Then the king of Israel and Judah's king, Jehoshaphat, went up to Ramoth Gilead. But the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will disguise myself and go into battle. But you wear your royal attire. So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. Now the king of Aram had ordered his 32 chariot commanders, do not fight with anyone at all except the king of Israel. When the chariot commanders saw Jehoshaphat, they shouted, he must be the king of Israel. So they turned to fight against him, but Jehoshaphat cried out. And when the chariot commander saw that he was not the king of Israel, they turned back from pursuing him. But a man drew his bow without taking special aim and struck the king of Israel through the joints of his armor. So he said to his charioteer, turn around and take me out of battle, for I am badly wounded. The battle raged throughout that day, and the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Arameans. He died that evening, and the blood from his wound flowed into the bottom of the chariot. Then the cry rang out in the army as the sun set, declaring, each man to his own city, and each man to his own land. So the king died and was brought to Samaria. They buried the king in Samaria. Then someone washed the chariot at the pool of Samaria. The dogs licked up his blood, and the prostitutes bathed in it, according to the word of Yahweh that he had spoken. The rest of the events of Ahab's reign, along with all his accomplishments, including the ivory palace he built and all the cities he built, are written in the historical record of Israel's kings. Ahab rested with his ancestors, and his son Ahaziah became king in his place. Jehoshaphat, son of Asa, became king over Judah in the 4th year of Israel's king Ahab. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he became king. He reigned 25 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Azubah, daughter of Shilhi. He walked in all the ways of his father Asa. He did not turn from them, but did what was right in Yahweh's sight. However, the high places were not taken down or taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. Jehoshaphat also made peace with the king of Israel. The rest of the events of Jehoshaphat's reign, along with the might he exercised and how he waged war, are written in the historical record of Judah's kings. He eradicated from the land the rest of the male cult prostitutes who were left from the days of his father Asa. There was no king in Edom. A deputy served as king. Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold, but they did not go because the ships were wrecked at Ezion Geber. At that time, Ahaziah, son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, let my servants go with your servants in the ships. But Jehoshaphat was not willing. And Jehoshaphat rested with his ancestors and was buried with them in the city of his ancestor David. His son Jehoram became king in his place. Ahaziah, son of Ahab, became king over Israel in Samaria in the 17th year of Judah's king Jehoshaphat. He reigned over Israel 2 years. He did what was evil in Yahweh's sight. He walked in the ways of his father, in the ways of his mother, and in the ways of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin. He served Baal and bowed in worship to him. He angered Yahweh, God of Israel, just as his father had done. And that is the reading of 1 Kings chapter 22, which concludes for us the text that has the story of Ahab. And we'll see Ahab, we see Jehoshaphat, we see Jehoram mentioned, and a bit of the detail of Ahaziah's reign here within Israel as well. The text picks up really 3 years after the final scene that we looked at. So remember, in the last scene is Naboth's vineyard, and how Ahab and Jezebel have both been wicked in taking it, killing an innocent man just out of pure greed. And remember that Yahweh had said that Ahab's blood was going to be spilled in that same place, so we can assume that Jezreel, and that the dogs would lick it up. But then Ahab had a moment of repentance, had a moment of humility, and it seems that Yahweh relented from that particular announcement concerning his death. And now 3 years have passed since then, and it should not surprise us that Ahab seems to be back to his normal wicked self. One of the signs of that, I believe, is the fact that he has all these prophets surrounding him who are basically yes men. These seem to be prophets who are on the royal payroll. Now they come onto the scene because Ahab recognizes that he needs to take Ramoth Gilead back from the king of Aram. Remember that this king, assuming this has still been Hadad, and him had an alliance previously, had a relationship, but now Ahab is going against him, wants to take this city back from him. So in order to do that, he enlists the help of King Jehoshaphat of Judah. So they go together. They say, "Hey, will you take this?" And he said, Ahab asked Jehoshaphat, "Will you help me take this?" He says, "I am as you are. My people is your people. My horses is your horses. Mikasa is Sukasa." Basically, we're brothers in this. We're of the same people. Yes, I will help you do what needs to be done. But he says, let's first see what Yahweh's will is. I'm sure that took Ahab back a little bit, like, oh man, I had all this going. He was on a roll with me. We were all in agreement. Now he wants to see what Yahweh wants us to do. And Ahab just does not seem to be very thrilled with the idea of having Yahweh involved in this whole process. So he gathers the prophets, about 400 men. Again, I believe these are the prophets on the payroll of Ahab. They are always telling him yes, whatever he wants to hear. And he says, should we go or should we refrain? And they're like, oh, no, you should definitely go. Yahweh, or they don't say Yahweh, the Lord will hand it over to the king. Yeah, you've got this. So he replied, all right, well, let's go. Jehoshaphat, though, isn't convinced. And he asks, isn't there a prophet of Yahweh here anymore? Let's ask him. He doesn't seem to buy in to the legitimacy of these prophets. And whenever Ahab hears this, he's like, oh, man. Yeah, there's this one guy. His name's Micaiah. But every time I ask him something, he always goes against me. So do we have to? And he says, well, yeah, this is what we need to ask him. Even though you hate him, we need to ask what he says. And Jehoshaphat even rebukes Ahab for the way that he speaks about Micaiah. So they call Micaiah to come. And in the meantime, they're sitting on their thrones and they have all the prophets around them. Zedekiah, one of the prophets, he seems to be the head prophet, the spokesman for the group. He steps forward and he has these iron horns that he's made. And you can just see him acting out this whole thing where he's got the horns. And he says, you're going to gore the Arameans with these until they're finished off. And all the prophets are doing the same thing. They're all saying, yes, you need to go up because Yahweh is going to hand this king over to you. Whenever Micaiah shows up, he's already been given instructions that, listen, you need to be in agreement with the rest of these prophets. So whenever he shows up and Ahab asks him, should we go? You could just see the sarcasm dripping off the tongue of Micaiah as he says this. He's like, oh, yes, march up and succeed. Yahweh will certainly hand Ramoth Gilead over to the king. Oh, yes, just do it. Oh, you'll be so successful. Again, just the sarcasm is certainly thick here. And I say that because whenever he hears this, the king hears what he wants to hear. So it's not the content of the message. It's got to be how the message was said. Because he says, how many times was going to make you swear to tell me, to not tell me anything except what Yahweh says? Obviously you're disagreeing with them. And because you disagree with them, there's no way that you're telling me what Yahweh says, because they've already told me this is what Yahweh wants. So Micaiah says, all right, I'll give you the real deal then on this whole issue, is that I see Israel on the hills and I see them scattering because they don't have a shepherd. So they need to all return to their own home. So the king looks at Jehoshaphat. He says, see, I told you this guy never says anything good to me. He's always talking about disaster. He always speaks against me. And then Micaiah speaks up again and gives them basically the background of why all of this has happened. He tells them of a scene from the spiritual realm. Yahweh sitting on his throne. And remember, Yahweh is described as Yahweh, Lord of armies, or Yahweh of armies, Yahweh of the heavenly host, that his throne is surrounded by his spiritual family, by the spiritual beings who make up his army in the spiritual realm. And they're sitting there talking, what Yahweh has seen the evil of Ahab. And Yahweh is basically deciding how Ahab's going to be taken out. And he asked the question, who's going to incite Ahab to march up and follow at Ramoth Gilead? He has decided this is how Ahab's going to be taken care of. So they're kind of talking back and forth. Okay, well, what about this idea? What about this plan? And then there's a spirit, again, a spiritual being that comes forward and says, I'll entice him. And Yahweh asks, how? How are you going to entice him? And he says, well, I'm going to do it by going to his prophets and telling them that they need to go up to be successful. But this is a lie. I'm going to be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. They're going to think that what I'm telling them, because I'm a spiritual being, because they're receiving this from Yahweh, that it is the truth, but it's just to set him up for failure. And Yahweh says, fine, go and do that. I don't know about you, but I can definitely understand people have a little bit of an issue with this. How can Yahweh use deception to accomplish his will? How can he allow that to happen? For me, it's no different than God using any sort of evil to his advantage. Think about in the life of Joseph. Joseph says, you meant it for evil, but God used it for good. This is simply the carrying out of God's will here on earth. And if this spirit wants to use deception, then God's allowing it to happen. Does not mean that God himself is the author of evil in any way. He is simply meting out justice. Ahab, because of his wickedness, he deserves to die. And this is the way that Yahweh is going to work out his death. So after Micaiah says all this, Zedekiah steps forward, he smacks Micaiah on the cheek, and he just basically says, there's no respect. I have no respect for you. Did the spirit of Yahweh lead me to speak to you? You don't deserve to have Yahweh speak to you. You're just you're a fake. You're a phony. And at this point, Micaiah says, okay, you say that, but we'll see the end results. We'll see who actually is telling the truth. So Ahab then takes Micaiah, throws him in jail, and says, you keep him there until I return safely. Basically using him as a collateral, saying, if I don't come back, you're done. So you better hope that Yahweh brings me back or you're dead. And Micaiah says, if he doesn't bring you back, then he didn't speak through me to begin with. So all y'all better listen or there's going to be trouble. And of course, they don't listen. We don't expect Ahab to listen, do we? Fortunately, though, Jehoshaphat also doesn't listen, because he does, in fact, go into battle with Ahab. Ahab, though, thinks that because he's sneaky, because he's smarter than everybody else, if I don't wear my royal garments, then they won't know who I am and they won't pursue me directly. But you, Jehoshaphat, you just go ahead and wear your royal garments. Jehoshaphat here's a big dummy. There's no way he should have done this. Because, of course, like we all expected, as soon as they see someone dressed like a king, they're going to pursue the king, because that's who Aram is really upset with. The king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, he's mad at him. He's mad at Ahab. He wants to take Ahab out specifically, so much so he says, don't pursue anybody else except him. So whenever they see the guy in the royal garments, which is Jehoshaphat, but who they assume is Ahab, they start chasing him, and Jehoshaphat's screaming. It says that Jehoshaphat cried out, and I'm sure he's saying, I'm not Ahab, I'm not Ahab, I'm not Ahab, stop chasing me. And whenever they figure out it's not Ahab, they do stop the pursuit. Yet there is no escaping the will of Yahweh. There is no escaping his will. For the text tells us that a man drew his bow, just shot randomly, and that arrow just so happened to pierce Ahab through the chink in his armor. You would think to be able to move, there'd probably be some spaces here, maybe some space on the side. My guess is that he probably got impaled somewhere around this area, because that would impel him, and he bled out slowly. So it doesn't seem like it was a direct heart shot, because that would have killed him pretty quickly. But it would have been just enough in the vitals, maybe in the stomach for more of a slow bleed. Somewhere right in here, the arrow pierced him, and he ends up dying. He bleeds out slowly in his chariot. And just like Yahweh said, the dogs came and licked up the blood, and the prostitutes bathed in it, according to the word Yahweh had spoken. And they even cried each man to his city. So everything exactly like Micaiah had said, exactly like Elijah in the previous chapter had said. Remember, he didn't die in Jezreel because there was a moment of repentance. There was a moment of humility. But still, what Elijah said did come to pass about the dogs licking up the blood, because he returned to his evil ways. So the rest of the events of Ahab's life are included there in the historical record of Israel's kings. He rested with his fathers, and then his son Ahaziah became king. We also learn that Asa has passed on the kingship to Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat's reign was a mixed bag. He did some good things, but he also did some not good things. He didn't take away the high places. He allowed the people to continue to worship at them. He also made peace with the king of Israel, which I would suggest was not a good thing. Many suggest, in fact, that he became a vassal to the king of Israel. He became a vassal to not only Ahab, but also to Ahaziah. They had an agreement to take ships down to Ophir. And after there was a big wreck at this place, Ezion Geber, Ahaziah said, hey, let's do this again. And Jehoshaphat's like, no, I'm not doing this again. I've wrecked once. I'm not doing this again. So he kind of rebels. If he is more of a vassal, if he is more subservient to Israel, he doesn't want to go along with that and kind of rebels against him. For Ahaziah's part, or actually for Jehoshaphat, his son Jehoram ends up becoming king in his place towards the end of chapter 22. And then Ahaziah is mentioned again, and he's just as bad as his dad, just as bad as his mom. He did what was evil in Yahweh's sight. He walked in the ways of his father, evil. Walked in the ways of his mother, evil. Walked in the ways of Jeroboam, evil. But he even carried on again further by worshiping straight up pagan gods instead of participating in paganistic worship of Yahweh. He served Baal and bowed in worship to him, and he angered Yahweh, God of Israel, just as his father had done. Unfortunately, different chapter, same story for the kings of Israel, and they certainly did not serve their nation well by leading them closer to God, but continued to lead them further and further away. So that's the end of Ahab's reign. Again, is most certainly defined by evil and wickedness. For some kings, that was how it just went. Other kings, it was more of a mixed bag, some good, some bad. But if you do have any questions or comments about this text, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below for our read here through 1 Kings 22. And tomorrow we will get into 2 Kings. We'll read chapters 1 and 2 together, both a couple of short chapters. We will see the end for Elijah, end of his ministry. But good for him. It did not end in death, but a pretty miraculous passing on from this life. Really excited to read that with you tomorrow as we get into the text of 2 Kings. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below about what we've read today. Looking forward to being with everybody for our Bible studies and worship assembly here in just a little while. Excited for our lesson in the worship assembly. We'll be continuing it through Mark 6, looking at Jesus feeding a multitude and then walking on the water and showing how it is that Jesus alone is able to bring true satisfaction. He can do this. No one else can. So we need to seek him and seek him alone. Excited to going through that study with you here in a bit. Have a great rest of your Sunday, everyone. Take care and God bless.